Multi-hazards, all about communities.
What's happening with climate change these days? How is our adaptation going? What are the gloomy and bright spots? Join Dr. Stewart J. Cohen, climate change adaptation scientist, as he discusses the latest science and societal discussions about humanity adapting to a rapidly changing climate. Have a listen. Hello, dear listeners. This episode is where I have a great conversation with climate change adaptation scientist Dr. Stewart J. Cohen. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of the First Nations groups who have inhabited this land that's around me since time immemorial. This area near me, also known as Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. So my guest for today is Dr. Stewart J. Cohen. He is an author and educator on human-caused climate change. Dr. Cohen is currently a part-time instructor on climate change adaptation at Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island on the southwest corner of Canada, and he is writing posts on his blog, drclimatechange.com. His university education was in geography, obtaining degrees from McGill University, the University of Alberta, and the University of Illinois. Dr. Cohen has recently retired from a 35-year research career with Environment and Climate Change Canada. He began his career in Toronto, where he created and led studies on the impacts of projected climate change throughout Canada, including the Great Lakes, Saskatchewan River, and the Mackenzie Basin. In 1995, as part of a research partnership agreement with the University of British Columbia, UBC, he moved to Vancouver and began developing collaborative projects with the UBC community. He led several climate change impact and adaptation studies of the Okanagan region and contributed to studies on forests in central and northern British Columbia and on projected climate impacts and adaptation actions in the Vancouver area. He also created and taught a graduate course, Climate Change in the 21st Century. This led to him publishing a textbook with that title in 2009 with McGill Queen's University Press. He has been a member of author teams for national assessments of climate change in Canada and the United States, as well as several publications of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Working Group 2, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. And now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Hi, everybody. This is Multi-Hazards, and we have Dr. Stewart J. Cohen, and he is an expert in climate change adaptation and also lives pretty close to me here. I'm living in Greater Vancouver on the southwest corner of Canada, and so is he. So, hi, Stewart. How have you been?
Been fine, Vin. Great to be here. Just try to stay safe from COVID. And also continuing to follow climate change news, of course. There's been an awful lot going on, including this year's heat wave and such. So, so very happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Right. And just to let our listeners know, the place where we live, we're going up the mountain of a fourth wave of COVID from the Delta variant. And we've had a bad heat wave that was about, almost a couple months ago, really bad, and a couple mini heat waves after that. And then we've had a few bouts of wildfire smoke. And of course, this is not as bad as the other parts of our province, British Columbia, in the interior, where they've had nonstop fires, they've had evacuations, they've had tons of wildfire smoke, probably for weeks and weeks. and they have a surge in the Delta virus. So actually, people like Stewart and I living on the coast here, we in that regard, we're kind of lucky. So don't you think so, Stewart?
Well, I'm glad we're not experiencing the smoke now. We experienced a little bit of it a couple of weeks ago, but the heat wave in late June hit the Vancouver area directly and led to several hundred deaths, and that's a very, very serious issue. And perhaps we could talk a little bit about um, what climate change can do to create these kinds of extreme events,
Right.
which are a big challenge for all of us.
Right, exactly. And so this ties in. So this is not just theory, but this is real life experience. And you're teaching right now, Royal Roads, you're teaching a course in climate change adaptation. And how's that been going?
Well, thanks for mentioning the Royal Roads course. The full title is Climate Change Adaptation Fundamentals.
Okay.
And that course has been underway now for about the last year and a half, and it is continuing. The next session will begin on October the 4th. It's a 4-week online course. So if any of your listeners are interested and want to check it out, they can go to the Royal Roads website, the page on Professional and Continuing Studies, or PCS, and the website is pcs.royalroads.ca/climate change. And on that site, you'll see not only the adaptation course, but also other online courses that are offered by Royal Roads.
That's great. That's wonderful. Now, I've noticed you've been keeping up with your blog. It's called Dr. Climate Change. And so, how's that been going?
Well, the Dr. Climate Change blog is continuing. There's certainly a number of climate change issues that are ongoing and news things that are happening that I'm watching. For instance, I'm watching the ongoing election campaign in Canada, and I'm looking for party positions on climate change. And I think that'll be an important thing to write about, which I will do fairly soon. I'm also watching for the upcoming International Conference of the Parties, or COP, that's going to happen in Glasgow. That's called COP26. I think that will be an important thing to watch. And there are, I'm thinking of some fairly big, I think, serious topics at some point that I'm going to want to talk about. One is just transition, and the other is greenwashing. Greenwashing being some of these promises of net zero emissions by industry. There's been some concern that this isn't real, so the term greenwashing has been placed on that. So I'd like to explore that too. So there's lots to write about, and I'm very interested in these things and very happy to be writing this blog.
Right, right. And it's excellent. It's excellent. I've been looking through it recently. Now, something that caught my eye is your recent blog. It's called The Mutation of Climate Change Denial. So that's always a juicy and also disturbing topic. And you argue that climate deniers in there have been mutating their message, just like the COVID-19 virus is mutating. So I'm just wondering, what's that all about?
Well, I use the metaphor of the virus pandemic because it seems to me I have seen this same mutation play out in the world of climate change denial. Now, there are people that don't agree with what scientists have been working on and have been communicating, but there are many that are actually political opponents and are using science as a disguise. There's a well-funded climate change denial industry. There are people who are supported to generate these narratives and to communicate them to the public. Now, initially, the first argument was global warming is not happening. But as warming continued and became more intense, it was a lot harder to communicate that message, although there's some who still do that. But the next iteration has been warming is happening, but it's natural because in the past, when there was less CO2 in the atmosphere, the past was warmer. And then another iteration after this has been warming is happening. And yeah, it's because of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, but warming is a good thing and it will be a good thing. So we've had these kinds of changes in the message over the last several decades. And when these particular messages have been assessed and analyzed, you find out a number of things. There's either flawed analysis being presented by these messengers, or they are doing what one would call cherry picking of bits and pieces of data or words and phrases pulled out of context. That goes on a lot too. And when they do that, they are counting on their audience not to fact check them. And of course, there is an audience that is very willing to listen to them because they agree with the politics too. So this kind of bubble emerges of deniers speaking to those who don't want climate action either, and it kind of feeds off each other. You get very aggressive postings on social media. You get a communication of profound disrespect for the science effort and an attempt to promote these critics as somehow being at the same level of quality as the science research produced worldwide. So again, these are political attacks that are disguised as climate criticisms.
Right. And it seems like with COVID-19, I don't know if it's the same people, but it seems they're doing it again to the scientists and the doctors and everybody, the epidemiologists who are trying to keep us all safe. And then they're fighting that too. So it just seems like, wow, these are life and death matters here. These are not just, this is not just a joke.
Oh, I agree. And I think you are seeing the same thing happening within the COVID-19 pandemic. There are people who try to deny the science of the virus, deny the science of the vaccines, deny the science of public health measures, and they have their political and ideological reasons for doing so. So yes, I think there are parallels between denial in the COVID-19 pandemic and denial within human-caused climate change. Both of these efforts are out there. There are political reasons why each set of parties does this. And it is up to not only the legitimate science community to continue to communicate what it knows, both within the science community, but also to the public at large and to governments, but also for this conversation to educate the public about the difference between legitimate science information and this kind of disguised political attack, which is there for a political purpose, but is actually detrimental to us. And so for me, I think it's really important that we encourage the public to get educated, to become educated consumers of this kind of information. And so whether it's about COVID and vaccines or whether it's about climate change, I think we have to increase the level of education on issues like this. And certainly when it comes to climate change, we have to do this in the public schools, certainly, but I think we also have to do this in the area of professional development. Engineers and accountants and insurance and foresters, they all take courses in professional development once they have their licenses to practice and they work. I think climate change has to become an explicit part of professional development. And it also has to become available in the adult learning environment. Like what I do at Royal Roads is an adult learning program. It's not a degree program. And so for me, this effort at education, I'll use this metaphor again. It's like a vaccine against misinformation. So the better, the greater effort we can undertake in education on issues like climate change, the greater our protection against misinformation. And I think we even have to go farther than that. We have to bring this information into the communities that don't want to hear it, but need to. And that's harder because, yeah, they don't want to hear it. And often we don't even get the stage or the forum to offer that message. It's kind of enclosed, you know, we can't get our foot in the door. But if there is ever an opportunity to do that, I think we should take it.
Right, exactly. So those are some of the solutions that you've already mentioned. Is there anything else that you think is important?
Well, besides kind of an ongoing education and communication effort, um, I think it is helpful to participate in these kind of social media activities. Podcasts like yours, I think, play an extremely valuable role. And so that's why I'm very happy to accept invitations to go on podcasts.
Okay, that's really excellent. And just to let everybody know, I had a podcast just before this one on conspiracy theories. And it's kind of funny, but because a lot of the solutions for conspiracy theories are similar to the solutions for climate change denial. So is that amazing, or is that strange? It seems there's a lot of connections to what's happening right now. So
It seems actually quite logical to me, Vin.
right. So let's move on to the next topic that was on your blog. It is the IPCC sixth assessment report, the physical science basis. And you put out that about, 2 weeks ago, that blog post. And so you were saying that this working group, it's a working group of the International Panel on Climate Change. It assessed the available scientific literature on historic climate patterns, future climate change scenarios, and their underlying causes. And this is done every, how many years is it, Stewart?
Well, the last assessment report, the fifth assessment report, was published in 2013 and 2014. So it's been 7-8 years since the previous cycle. Now, the IPCC does shorter reports in between these big assessment cycles, so they're always operating. But that's the timing of the fifth assessment, was about 8 years ago.
Okay. Now, is there anything new here, or is this basically reiterating the facts from the last one?
Well, again, first, a reminder that this is Working Group 1. There are 3 working groups. Working Group 1 focuses on the climate itself, the climate trends, and the future climate projections. So it doesn't talk about the impacts, the risks, and vulnerabilities, and it doesn't talk about the options for reducing emissions. So that's going to come later. So you asked the question, is there anything new here from a climate science perspective? And I would say that here we now have almost another decade of observations, of data, of new research. The previous Working Group 1 document covered literature basically up to 2012. And the conclusion this time around is actually, in the first instance, one of higher certainty, higher confidence that our world is warming, and it is because of us, and our world will warm because of us. Now, the first document that was released is the summary for policymakers. It's this short 20, 25 page summary of a full document that'll probably be 1,000+ pages. And there was a word that appeared right at the beginning of this document related to the conclusion that our world is warming, and it is because of us. And the word is unequivocal. The word unequivocal means clear, unambiguous, and no doubt. Now, I point to the existence of this word here because the summary for policymakers does not get released unless there is unanimous agreement among all of the governments that are present in the review of this document. Now, this process is incredibly intense. For at least a week, you have representatives of over 100 countries who are there to review every single word of the summary for policymakers, every word, every table, every graphic. And until you have unanimous agreement, that sentence or that graphic is not accepted. And so we're all locked up in this room trying to find a compromise so that we get unanimous agreement on the language of the summary for policymakers. And then once that happens and the document is released, then those changes filter back to the full 1,000-page report, and that gets published and released as well. So the fact that that word is in the document means that every government had to accept it. They had to accept it, regardless of what government it was, whether it was, a Western democracy like ours or an oil-producing country in the Middle East. They all had to accept the word unequivocal. So that means any message from climate change deniers that expresses doubt that greenhouse gas emissions for fossil fuels are warming the climate, well, this word unequivocal is as clear a statement as one could make, not just from the science community, but from all the governments that agreed that that word should be there. There should be no doubt. Emissions of greenhouse gases are warming the climate now, and fossil fuels are a major cause. So that, I think, is something new, that level of certainty. And there's a second thing I would like to point to, and that is that there is now a lot more information on the influence of human-caused climate change on extremes, droughts and floods, and the heat wave we just experienced in Vancouver in June. This growing body of literature is known as attribution studies. It's kind of like pathology or looking for fingerprints. And you've got two categories of these. One is the traditional refereed science literature that takes a couple of years to carry out and review and publish. You also have these rapid assessments where scientists get together and use their tools to assess an event as quickly as they can, and they post it to a website that hosts this. And I give that information in this blog post. So you've got both these long-term published attribution studies, and you also have these rapid assessments. I think that body of literature is very important because it's telling not just the science community, but also the public, that there is a body of literature that tells us what role human-caused climate change has in an extreme event that we are experiencing now. So we don't have to wait 50 years before we see serious extremes happening because of climate change. They're happening already. They're happening today. They happened last year. They happened 5 years ago. They happened 10 years ago. So this is a clear and current issue, and science is identifying the role climate change has in these things. And I think that's also a very important message that is coming out from this Working Group 1 report.
Right, right. And so there was one scientist critiquing this and saying, well, maybe we should put more energy into new science rather than just trying to prove the same old thing, even though updating it just because of some politicians who are not taking action. So what would you say to that?
So who are you referring to?
So this is an article from Dr. Elan Kelman. Yes, he was talking, he said a new climate change report without much new overall. So yeah, he's basically saying that this has been going on and it's being updated, but I guess he's talking about the scale and having so many, I guess it would be thousands and thousands of scientists who are all working on this, and like, do we need to do this every decade, or can maybe we streamline it and then scientists' time could be put into looking in more of these details and improving the science? That's what I'm guessing that the argument is here.
Okay. Well, thanks for mentioning Dr. Kelman's piece. And I have read it. The piece is quite recent. I think it came out earlier this year. So, he's asking the question, is it time to stop the
earlier this
IPCC
month,
assessment reports? So I want to address a couple of his questions because I think they're extremely important, certainly in the context of the discussion we're having here today. So one of the questions he asks is it helpful for the IPCC to garner so much policy attention? And when I saw that question, my first response was, is Dr. Kelman jealous of the IPCC? I mean, the IPCC was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. So clearly there are some who think that this is worthwhile, and surely Dr. Kelman knew about this. So to question its value in the face of winning a Nobel Peace Prize, my response to that is, really? And I kind of have a similar response to another question that he asks in his piece, which is, how much original research has not been done because people were exhausted addressing over 1,000 often irreconcilable comments on their draft IPCC chapter? That is true that it is a very exhausting process, and I have been an IPCC author several times over a course of many years, so I know firsthand what that's like. But when I see that question, I kind of have a similar reaction to it. I say, really? Does Dr. Kelman truly believe that scientists volunteering their time for IPCC are not capable of managing their time, of continuing their own research while they do this? Has he actually spoken to any of them? Is kind of something I would ask him. So, I mean, if he would speak to me, because I myself was a lead author on the third assessment and the
Okay.
fourth assessment and the fifth assessment. So I was quite happy to accept the call and volunteer for all three of those. And yeah, that took a lot of time, but my research activities continued each time. That didn't stop. And I would say that for most of my fellow authors, they were continuing their research work while they were doing this. And then finally, his conclusion, where he says, the real question is whether or not we will be having exactly the same discussion when the IPCC's 7th or 17th assessment report begins. And somehow he seems to be saying that all this is the IPCC's fault. Again, really? No, no. The IPCC has established itself as the standard for worldwide assessment, not just of climate science, but of the breadth of the entire climate change research literature. Climate trends and climate projections and impacts, vulnerabilities, risks, adaptation, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and what the options are. And since deniers are continuing their efforts to spread misinformation, there will continue to be a need for this standard, certainly for a while longer, certainly until governments and businesses and the general public change how they produce and consume energy, change from a high carbon to low carbon energy system, but also until we all do more to reduce vulnerabilities and risks. So I profoundly disagree with what Dr. Kelman has said in this article. And I urge him to invest some time in talking with IPCC authors, learning about their experiences, and on why they agreed to invest their time in this effort. And certainly, if he was to speak to me, this is what I would tell him. I came back gladly to do the fourth and fifth assessment after my experience with the third assessment. Um, and yeah, it was a lot of time, but no, it didn't affect my science. And yes, I think it was important to have a worldwide standard for climate change information, given all the misinformation that is out there. And so, yeah, I believe the IPCC continues to serve an extremely important role. Uh, and I hope that it continues, and I wish it all the success in the world.
Okay. Now that was a strong rebuttal. So now I'm wondering which other reports are scheduled for release in the coming months
Okay,
or
so
years.
as part of the sixth assessment cycle, um, yeah, the other working groups are going to report. So working group two, that's the one that I worked on, by the way, in my past involvement with them.
Okay.
Its focus is on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability. Its summary for policymakers will be reviewed in February 2022. It will go through the same process that the working group one summary was. So February 2022, that's when we should hear about that. And then the working group three report on mitigation greenhouse gases, that review is scheduled for March of 2022. And then finally, there will be what they call a synthesis report, where they address questions that cross the boundaries between the groups. And that review is scheduled for September of 2022, and that will conclude the sixth assessment cycle.
Okay. Excellent. Now, looking to Canada here, there's one called Canada in a Changing Climate, the National Issues Report. And I understand that you're a member of the advisory committee for this assessment, which has been underway since 2016, and you wrote about it on your blog. So I'm wondering how that's been being a member of that committee.
Oh, I've enjoyed that very much. It's been a great experience to be part of that process, to offer some advice to this new team of authors. Great seeing new authors from across Canada contributing to these assessments. So you're seeing the younger generation stepping up now and taking lead authorship roles, which I think is fantastic. So that's been great.
That's awesome. And what are the highlights of this report?
Okay, so we've just been talking about the IPCC assessing international literature worldwide. This is specifically the Canadian slice of that literature, and it's specifically focusing on adaptation in Canada. The National Issues Report complements the other documents in this series, which are going to focus specifically on regions. So the Prairies Region Report came out a few months ago. there will be other regional reports that will come out later this year and next year, including one on British Columbia and another one on Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and the North. So all those are still to come. This national issues report that was released, there were, I think, a couple important things in it that I'd like to share. The first is that it's very clear that communities of all sizes across the country are already experiencing impacts on their infrastructure, on public health, on economies, and that these changes in climate are threatening vital ecosystem services, including water resources. So this is happening already, and communities are reporting this. And unfortunately, what the author team has found is that there are large gaps still in preparedness for climate change, and that's been demonstrated by recent floods, recent wildfires, the heat wave that we just had. So these gaps in preparedness are very important to highlight so that ultimately um, Canadians can begin to work on that. But there is good news in this report. There are lessons on good adaptation practices that are emerging from a number of communities, and the report includes case studies of adaptation actions, including a map showing their locations. So it's encouraging to see the growth in climate change adaptation practice in Canada. And so it's a great chance to share some positive experiences of those communities that are doing some early work proactively to reduce their risk. But I think very important to note, there's one of the chapters called Sector Impacts and Adaptation. That's chapter 7. And this was their conclusion. They said, quote, "There is urgency associated with accelerating adaptation action. Urgency is most clear where current climate risks are not adequately managed and where investment decisions made today have implications extending for many decades to come." So I think that's a clear message coming from this national issues report.
Right, right. And you're saying this urgency should lead to action. That's the most important thing.
Oh,
Not just,
absolutely.
yeah, not just waiting till the feeling goes away. Okay, tomorrow
Or
morning
not
I'll wake
just,
up, I don't feel the urgency.
not just
Mhm.
waiting until you have to react to something.
Right,
So how can I put this? Basically, I think the message here, and a message that I would offer right now to your listeners, is you can't fight tomorrow's battles with yesterday's battle plans. That includes using yesterday's climate statistics, which were the basis of existing water infrastructure, flood maps, public health plans, resource management plans, land use plans. They were all based on yesterday's climate statistics. So all of this needs to be reassessed using a range of available climate change future scenarios to see what happens to these risks under these available systems. And if you do these assessments, and if you find that risks, impacts are projected to get worse, then action will be clearly needed to update the plans and update the structures. So scenario-based assessments of existing systems on the ground, I think, are urgently needed so that we can have the information, that practitioners especially can have the information to figure out how to update existing systems, guidance, codes, designs to better prepare ourselves for future climate change, including the future extremes to come.
right, exactly. And it's almost like COVID-19. We can't really base our plans for the next few weeks on the last wave or the last two waves. We've got to actually have modelers in there who are feeding us information that we can go on to make our plans, right?
Well, we are actually seeing now the importance of COVID modeling. So the public at large is now being exposed to what it means to actually have information about scenarios of the future in place now to help make decisions and to help inform the public. In the climate change world, we've been doing this for decades. COVID is happening at rapid speed. So we have to catch up with this language, including the language of modeling of scenarios, which is exactly what COVID modelers are talking about. So you see scenarios where there are mask mandates or there aren't, scenarios where there's high levels of vaccination or there aren't, and you see the difference in cases that are being projected. So yeah, it's absolutely necessary to do this kind of scenario-based modeling in order to prepare ourselves for what's coming ahead. And And I think these are very difficult lessons to learn. And this is a speeded up motion. So public health officials and governments, they have to react in the matter of days. In climate change, we've been having this debate over years and decades, and this is happening over days. It's a much, much faster process, but it's quite similar.
Right. I hope we learn something from it too. Apply it to climate change. So that's my hope. Keep my fingers crossed. So there's another blog you wrote. It's called Optimism and Pessimism. And basically, that's a very important topic because it seems that if people are studying about climate change, and I've even seen on Twitter some of the climate change scientists themselves, they get depressed. It's just like looking at all this stuff that's going on. And you are also talking about a case for optimism. So what was that blog about?
Well, let's start with the pessimists. There are a number of people that express this attitude. They might be in the environment field, they might be in energy research, and there are certain indicators they watch that lead them to feel pessimistic. So, for example, here we've been talking about the need to find ways to reduce our carbon consumption and to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, and yet consumption of fossil fuels is continuing to increase. There's no sign of it slowing down, and that includes fossil-based electricity. So we may be getting excited that electric vehicles are coming, but if all the electricity we use is coming from oil and coal, well, are we solving the problem? And if you listen to agencies like the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which looks at future projections of all energy forms, they're projecting that oil demand is going to continue to increase at least the rest of this decade. So that's certainly a ground for feeling pessimistic. And of course, opponents who want to obstruct climate action, one of the things that they'll do is they'll see this and they'll try to divert focus away from renewables towards technologies that still allow high carbon fuels to continue to be used. So I get a little worried about the seemingly high level of interest in things like gray hydrogen, which is produced by fossil fuels, because this will enable fossil fuel production to continue, and I'm not so sure that we're going to reduce emissions. So that kind of whole thing is out there. But I'm also a bit discouraged by the fact we get disagreement among allies of climate action regarding certain things. So whether you're an environmental activist or you're a retired climate change scientist like me, we're on the same side of this. But there's some profound disagreement on certain things. And I'll just mention one point that I think is important, and that's just transition. Just transition is supposed to be, how do we enable people who have invested themselves, their time, their professions, and their money in the fossil fuel industry for years, decades, even longer, how can they become part of the solution? So there's been the recent experience in Ireland, which I wrote about in my blog. They're debating a bill called the Climate Action Bill this year. The opposition to that bill has claimed there's not enough support for people who work in a fossil energy industry. In Ireland's case, it's peat farming, because there are, especially rural communities, that burn peat for energy. So not enough support for them. No definition of what just transition actually looks like. No guidance as to what it means. So here you've got a country trying to have a bill on this, and they can't agree on the whole transition. And so there's been another organization called the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. They have written about the danger of poor or unplanned low carbon transition, that it could exacerbate inequalities between rich and poor. So, here you have disagreement among allies on something like this. So I think that, yeah, that kind of adds to this sense of pessimism.
Right, right. And how about for optimism? How do you keep optimistic about all this?
Well, I think there is a case to be made for optimism. I mentioned electric vehicles. I think they have an important role to play in our portfolio of climate actions. There isn't going to be a single silver bullet in all of this. We're going to need a portfolio, and it's going to have many things in it. I think electric vehicles is going to be a really, really important part of that, complemented by increased production of renewables like solar power and wind power. And you look at what's happening here in British Columbia. There was just an announcement about recent sales of electronic vehicles that in 2020 in BC, 9.4% of all vehicle sales in BC were electronic vehicles. 9.4%. That's well ahead of schedule, where the BC government was hoping to achieve 10% by 2025. So we're already at 9.4% in 2020. That's pretty good. This is, by the way, part of what the government called the Zero Emission Vehicles Act. So we're ahead of schedule here with electronic vehicle sales. I think that's fantastic. And I think that this is part of what we need to do for consumers, for the public who are trying to figure out, well, what can I do in the marketplace so I can reduce my personal carbon footprint? Consumers need to be enabled to have access to things like electronic vehicles, so that they can let their money do the talking. They can actually do things to reduce their carbon footprint. So electronic vehicles and other products, they need to become more available. They need to become more accessible. And this should be the focus. We should be talking a lot more about this and not doing things and saying things that actually make polarization worse. So when it comes to just transition, which, I mean, we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about that today, but I think, and that's something I want to write about in a future blog post. I think we need to pay serious attention to about what this is and what this isn't, because right now we've got too much polarized conversation and dialogue going on here that, in my view, makes just transition much, much harder to achieve. And if it's harder to achieve, then there will continue to be an audience for climate change deniers and for opponents of climate action. So we have to get this right. So I think that's extremely important. But with the growth of EVs and so on, there are reasons to be optimistic, and that's why I myself, I still think that I'm an optimist about this, despite the theme of a lot of my blog posts, which is a snowball's chance. And if you know what a snowball's chance means, that's kind of the opposite of being optimistic. But I am optimistic.
Okay, I get that. So now you were mentioning about the carbon footprint, and I just thought about where I live. I see these electric vehicles everywhere, and one of the nice things too is it decreases the noise pollution and also decreases the air pollution. That's a biggie there. And having your personal carbon footprint decreased, and we've seen it in COVID too, people are flying less. So there's actually a lot of pluses there. But then some people are saying that this is just a ploy of the big fossil fuel companies. They're trying to take away their responsibility. And also there's a lot of industries that are involved that are using fossil fuels. But there's this sort of conspiracy, they're saying, that exists, and it's trying to just push it on to people as individuals, that's where you solve the problem, not in the systemic. So I'm just wondering if you have some comments about that.
Well, it seems to me that we all have roles, not only in who we vote for during elections, but we have roles as consumers. And I think in both of these roles, as voters and as consumers, we should not be trying to somehow separate ourselves from what's going on in governments and in the marketplace. Our purchasing decisions do matter, and they will matter, just like our votes do matter, and they will matter. So I don't think this is a ploy. I think that this is a challenge. We can't be separating ourselves from this and saying that, if only this politician would push this magic button that's on his or her desk, the problem would be solved. And the only thing that's stopping this politician from doing it is some ambiguous phrase, political will. You often hear that. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. And I think one of the reasons why governments have trouble achieving greenhouse gas emission targets is because the public, including the consumer, make it very difficult for that government to succeed. This really needs to involve all of us. It needs to involve all of us, not just when we're thinking about who to vote for, but what our personal consumption decisions are, what we do with our money when we buy things. We can't separate ourselves from this. So no, it's not a ploy, it's a challenge. And I think as consumers, we all have to take it seriously. We have to look for ways to reduce our personal carbon footprint. And yet it would help if the marketplace would make it easier for us to do that. But I think we also have to make that a high priority for ourselves in our day-to-day lives. We have to take this seriously. And I think that, yeah, we are responsible too as consumers.
Right, right. So now there's an election coming. I'm wondering if there anything that you would like to say about that. I know you're going to write a blog post about that, Stuart, but is there anything that you think you would maybe advise the parties to say or the public to think about?
Well, yeah, I will be writing a post on this, and obviously there's not a whole lot of time to do this because I'd like that post to come out before the election. So that is just something I'm going to work out. And by the way, I did write a post before the 2019 election, so I invite your listeners to check out the blog post I wrote in 2019 before that election. Um, but yeah, it's an incredibly important topic, and I'm happy to see that there is a lot of interest in the nuts and bolts of climate action. So those parties that have already released platforms, including the current government, the Trudeau government, that presented a very detailed set of actions in their budget 2020 that came out only a few months ago, quite detailed. So a lot of interest in carbon pricing, in electric vehicles, in carbon capture technologies. So there's a lot of stuff to sort through. And I think for voters, um, especially voters that are interested in climate change, I would urge them to um, look for the information about these nuts and bolts, because I think that's going to be very, very important. Don't get too distracted by statements about targets. I think that is a very distracting statement, and I don't think that provides information that helps the voter decide which party to vote for. I think we have to pay attention to the nuts and bolts that are in the platforms. How much support will electric vehicles get? How much support will carbon pricing get? How much support will there be for proactive adaptation planning, nature-based solutions, and so on? I think we need to hear about this, and we need to see this kind of discussion elevated during the election campaign. I think we need to get candidates to talk about what are the specifics that they want to support and how will they make those things actually happen. So yeah, I'm going to try to get as much information I can from the various parties and sort through that and post a blog on that before the election happens.
That sounds great. So, Stuart, in climate change adaptation, now I know you've covered so many topics on your blog and in the class you teach, but for adaptation, what do you think is the most urgent issue right now?
Um, well, earlier in our podcast, I mentioned that when deniers communicate their disrespect, I think that's a very particular issue that we have to educate ourselves enough so that we can fight back against these messages of disrespect for climate change. But on the specific area of adaptation, I think the most urgent issue is surprise. Let me go back to what I mentioned earlier. We can't fight tomorrow's battles with yesterday's battle plans, and that includes yesterday's climate statistics. Now, it's the reason why I talk about climate change adaptation and I don't talk about climate adaptation. Previous generations were always carrying out climate adaptation. They were adapting on the basis of lived experiences, on things that they were seeing and feeling themselves or what their parents were feeling. Um, the challenge we have now is fundamentally different because we have to find ways to carry out adaptation planning on the basis of future climate change scenarios. These are two very different things. Adapting on the basis of a lived experience versus proactive adapting on the basis of a future projection of climate change. And so the question that I'll have is, do practitioners have the tools to do this effectively? I mean, we were surprised by this heat wave. The heat wave overwhelmed public health officials, emergency preparedness planners, municipal governments, provincial governments. The cooling centers, sure, they had plans, they had cooling centers, they were set up, but we still had several hundred people who died in the course of a week because this heat wave was just so severe. This was surprise. So if we don't have the tools, if the professional engineers and the public health planners and the water managers don't have the tools to do this, then we will basically still be doing rules of thumb on the basis of past experience with some added arbitrary safety margin, which is the kind of conversation I'd been witnessing a couple of years ago when I was part of a team discussing how do we update our flood maps. And I would talk to engineers and hydrologists who said, the only thing we know how to do, given the tools we have, is we take an existing flood map based on an existing flood record, and we'll add a higher level of safety to it, a higher safety margin. So a higher height for a flood map, or maybe a city water manager will just make sewer pipes bigger, or a tree planting strategy will be the same one as we've always done, but we'll tweak things a little bit so that there's more space between a house and a tree in the urban forest interface. So if all we have are rules of thumb and we try to add to that, it leaves us open to surprise. And so we need to find ways to quantitatively include climate change scenario projections in practitioner tools of practice that allow us to test existing guidance, structures, codes, to see how well they work and whether they're robust or whether they fail. And then that'll allow us more specific entry points to designing new plans, new guidance, new structures, new flood maps, and so on. So this is what we're going to have to do, is we're going to have to address this issue of surprise. And it's going to challenge virtually every field of practice out there. It's going to challenge their tools. Do their tools have the coding that enable them to use quantitatively climate change scenario projections in their computer code? And if those don't exist, can tools be created in these fields of practice that make that possible? So I think that's an urgent challenge to fields of practice to assess their current tools, and if needed, to develop new tools so that climate change scenario information can be quantitatively assessed for how and applied to these questions of how well systems respond and how robust adaptation plans are.
Right. Now, I'm wondering, you're kind of talking more from the I guess the engineer and city planners point of view, the people who are involved in the hard infrastructure. But I'm just wondering, for example, is there another level, say, of the people like on the ground who are coming from it from a more societal level? And for example, in the springtime, we know that we'll probably get wildfire smoke, which will challenge a lot of people who have breathing problems, different kinds of people who are working outside. And we know that we might actually have some heat waves so that we can prepare ahead of time, because it seems like during this heat wave, like I was really mad. And the reason I was angry is because I'd spent 3 years studying heat waves, and they had the big Chicago heat wave of 1995. And there's so many studies on it, but it's like we were caught unawares and say, oops. And it was the vulnerable seniors who mostly got it. And it's kind of like, well, we could have had better plans to just cooling centers. We could have stepped up and kind of had this, because there have been so many studies already. So I'm just wondering what you say to that.
I mean, we even had the report from the 2017 wildfires by George Abbott and Maureen Chapman. And one of the results of that assessment of the 2017 fires was that the recommendations of the Filman report from the 2003 fires, many of those recommendations had not been followed 14 years later, right? So I think that this represents, I don't know, what you call it, inertia, or something. Whatever it is, I think the way to get through that is, you mentioned learning about the Chicago heat wave. I think that what the national issues report that we just talked about, what they did in highlighting the success stories of some communities, listing out cases, having a map. Again, I would urge your listeners, check that out in the national issues report. This listing of these adaptation cases. I think that local and regional planning is really, really important because it enables us to kind of see things more easily. It's kind of hard to visualize global climate change, but when you see a city or a region around you, you can identify what the challenges are. You can set goals at those scales. You can visualize the actions, and you can track the results, whether it's reducing risk and adaptation or tracking local scale greenhouse gas emissions too. And you can network with other communities and see what they're doing. Networking is so important because it reminds you that you're not alone. And we have networks. We have networks of municipalities constantly talking to each other. In British Columbia, you've got the Union of BC Municipalities, the UBCM. They're constantly exchanging information. And scale that up nationally, you've got the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the FCM. So I think we need to take advantage of these existing networks, and also advantage of those municipalities that have done some early work, that have been kind of first responders in a sense, but not just doing something quickly in hours and days, but actually trying to execute an adaptation plan, get it through a city council and get the contracts and build something. So there are communities that are doing this now. I think we need to highlight all of that and get that out there, share those stories with others, and then use all of this to scale it up to the country as a whole.
Right, right. And just want to mention, yeah, it's easy to kind of highlight all the problems, right, without saying that the successes that go unreported. There was this community of Logan Lake. I don't know if you heard about them, but they actually spent 10 years coming up with a plan to save their little town from a wildfire that was ripping through, and they actually succeeded in saving it a couple weeks ago. But it was a 10-year plan, and they had many people working on it. So when I read that story, I was really like, wow, that was amazing. When you hear about all the evacuations. Yeah.
There are a lot of stories like that out there, and I think they need some bright spotlights need to be shone on them. So as much as we can to get those stories out and get them distributed across communities across the country so that people can learn from what other communities are doing. I think that's really important.
Right, that's awesome. Now, do you have one last message for the audience that you'd love to leave burning in their ears?
Well, then I think that the quick message that I would leave here is that climate change is everybody's business. I talked about the need to becoming an educated consumer of climate change information. I think everybody needs to become better educated consumers of climate change information, but also find your role in this. Whatever your background, whatever your career path, whatever you're doing, because of the pervasiveness of this issue, that it is profoundly affected by individual decisions we make with our wallets, the purchasing decisions that we make, the carbon footprints that come from our lifestyles, but also the work that we do, whatever our professions are, engineers, planners, teachers, accountants, insurance, all of these things. I think that if you make climate change your business too, and you bring it into your lifestyle, and you bring it into your trade, and you bring it into your profession, I think that's going to help a government be successful in climate action. So I think that's my message, Finn. That climate change is everybody's business.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Stewart, for being with this podcast right now. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much and take care.
Thank you, Vin. Thank you for having me.
And that's it. Wow. A big shout out to my awesome guest, Dr. Stewart J. Cohen, for joining me here today at the Multi-Hazards Podcast. And an important disclaimer here. Number one, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. 2, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thanks to you again, my precious listeners, for joining us today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.